I want to show you two very interesting churches that I've personally had the opportunity to spend some time in. Now, they couldn't possibly be more distant or different from each other, or more completely opposite in their design and their history. But they do share a certain ironic connection. First, let's go to the capital of Scotland, Edinburgh. This ancient and unique city is full of so much history and so many convoluted layers of culture and tradition. The center of the city is arranged along a high street called the Royal Mile, which runs along the spine of an ancient hill, from the medieval Edinburgh Castle at the top down to the Palace of the Holyrood, where the British monarch sits on the throne of Scotland. These days, the Royal Mile is full of students, street performers, and of course, tourists. Here's a statue of Adam Smith, the guy who first invented and defended capitalism and the free market. I wonder if this statue has gotten torn down by the students yet. About halfway along the Royal Mile is St. Giles Cathedral, built in the year 1124. Now, I've visited a couple of times, and it never fails to impress you, not only with its Gothic architecture, but its trappings of power, prestige, and monarchy. Including this chapel, the Chapel of the Thistle, where the British Knightly Order of the Thistle is enshrined and holds its ceremonies. Now, let's leave dreary, sooty old Scotland for a very, very different kind of place. In fact, the very place where I grew up. Orange County, California. There are no castles or palaces, narrow streets, or sooty old buildings here. Just beaches and sunshine, freeways, endless tract houses, shopping malls, strip malls, fast food joints, and of course, Disneyland, the original Disneyland. I grew up and went to high school literally 7 miles from that fake fiberglass Matterhorn mountain. And only 2 miles from the fake Matterhorn, 5 miles from where I grew up, was this place. This couldn't be more different than that old Gothic pile St. Giles Cathedral on the Royal Mile in Scotland. In the shadow of Mickey Mouse and the fake Matterhorn, for most of its life, this was called the Crystal Cathedral, where the Reverend Robert Schuller proclaimed the power of positive thinking on his televised Hour of Power show every week. I've been in it several times for meetings over the years when I worked in Christian publishing, and even once as the keynote speaker at an event. I got to stand behind that pulpit and give a speech. It was a trip. I could tell you stories if I had time, but I don't. So, what could St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh and the Crystal Cathedral in Orange County possibly have in common, other than that they both have the word cathedral in their name? Well, nothing. I mean, that's pretty much it. They both have the word cathedral in their name. Except for this irony. One of them used to actually be a cathedral, but isn't anymore. And the other never was a cathedral, but recently became one. Confused? Good. So pay attention to this episode, because we're going to learn the who's, the what's, the whens, the where's, and the whys of the uniquely Catholic objects that we call cathedrals. And stick around to the end when I'll tell you the rest of the story about the gloomy old Gothic St. Giles in Edinburgh and the glass tower in Anaheim.
I'm Greg Smith, and over the next year I'll be your guide around the world and back and forth through the ages as we discover the Catholic story and how the Church has preserved the faith once and for all given to the saints.
Welcome to episode 22 of One Whirling Adventure. You know, I think most people, including probably almost all Protestants and truthfully probably half of modern Catholics, are a little confused about cathedrals. They tend to think of cathedrals as being big, impressive church buildings, and so almost any landmark church building gets lumped into the cathedral basket in their mind. Some people use the word to mean almost any kind of impressive space that makes one feel reverent. In fact, sometimes you hear people describe places like this as cathedrals because they inspire natural awe and wonder. Sometimes people lump impressive cathedrals like this with pagan places like this into a category of spiritual landmarks or spiritually powerful places. Tourists tend to think of cathedrals as medieval museums and monuments like Notre Dame in Paris, or Florence Cathedral in Italy, or Cologne Cathedral in Germany, or St. Patrick's Cathedral in New York City. They walk through these cathedrals, snapping selfies and posting on their Facebook or their Instagram. But in the Roman Catholic Church, cathedrals have a very specific technical meaning and function. And while their purpose in the Roman Catholic Church hasn't changed in almost 1700 years, their role in society has absolutely changed as Christianity has atrophied in places like Europe and the Americas, and technology and urban development have evolved. So, to make sense of these uniquely Catholic objects, let me serve you up today 10 fun facts that you might or might not have known about Catholic cathedrals. Fun fact number 1, a cathedral is a seat. That's literally what the name means. Cathedral is derived from the Greek word cathedra, which literally means chair. And so, in the ancient church and its branches and daughters like Roman Catholicism, Greek Orthodoxy, and Anglicanism, the technical definition of a cathedral is any church, large or small, fancy or plain, that contains the seat of a bishop from which he exercises his authority as teacher and magistrate of his diocese. So, in every cathedral you will see a literal chair, like this, or this, or these. Here's the bishop's chair in our own Cathedral of St. Andrew in the Diocese of Grand Rapids. The chair is usually positioned near the sanctuary, the space around the altar. But it's important to note that the chair is not in the center of the sanctuary. That's always the altar, the place of Christ's sacrifice. That must be central. The bishop's chair or seat or cathedra is always secondary to and adjacent to Christ. Now, of course, the bishop has an office adjacent to the cathedral somewhere. We'll talk more about that in a little bit, where he conducts regular work and business on a day-to-day basis. But the chair is reserved for formal occasions and liturgies where he sits in his vestments and presides in his capacity as Christ's representative, overseer of the diocese. And that distinguishes cathedrals from every other type of church. In some dioceses, the cathedral might not even be the biggest or most historic church building. But if the bishop has his seat there and is thus using it as his seat of governance, then it is the cathedral church of that diocese, which explains why there can only be one cathedral in a diocese. If the current cathedral burns down or is being renovated or a new one is being built, then the cathedral status transfers temporarily or permanently to another church. And it's why most Protestant denominations don't have cathedrals, because most Protestants don't have bishops. Now, they might have a big important church building, but it isn't a cathedral because it doesn't contain the seat of a bishop. Fun fact 2, bishops are biblical. Most Protestants don't have cathedrals because most Protestant denominations don't have bishops. Coming out of the Reformation, and ever since, most Protestants have argued that bishops aren't biblical. They'll say, show us where the word bishop is in the Bible. I remember that when I was a Protestant. Well, of course it isn't, because bishop is an English word, and the New Testament, which describes the church, is written in Greek. which of course doesn't have English words because it was written 2,000 years ago in Greek, 16 centuries before Shakespeare started writing down anything that we, recognize as modern English. But what St. Paul does describe in the New Testament are three church offices: diakonoi, which translates into English as something like servants or ministers; presbytery, which translates as elders or priests; and episkopoi, which translates as overseers. Now, in English, diakonoi have pretty obviously become the office of deacon. In most Protestant churches, presbyters are church elders and pastors. In Roman Catholicism, presbyters are priests. In the ancient church, from which Roman Catholicism and Greek Orthodoxy evolved before the Reformation in the 1500s, episkopoi, or overseers, were the senior pastors and teachers and magistrates over a city or an entire city. And all of the various house churches and Christian associations and monasteries or convents or whatnot within that city were under their oversight. One of the ways to make sense of the etymology of words is to listen to the consonant patterns. So listen to that Greek word episkopoi or episkip. In Italian, it became vescovo. In Spanish, obispo. In French, bec. In Middle English, from the medieval period, it was rendered as biskup. Now, as modern English sort of evolved, the hard K sound softened into an SH, a sh. So a biskup becomes biskup, which eventually becomes our bishop. But they all mean the same thing: the biblical office of episkopoi, the overseer in the church. A bishop is responsible for carrying out the threefold office of Christ as prophet, priest, and king in his diocese. So teaching, overseeing correct doctrine, and shepherding the flock of the diocese through his priests, and governing the property, finances, and affairs, and moral governance of the Catholics within his diocese. So overseeing things like confirmations and annulment courts and whatnot. And wherever the overseer, the episkopos or bishop in English, exercises his authority, his seat of governance, is the diocesan cathedral. Fun fact number 3. All bishops are appointed by the Pope. The first bishop was Simon Peter the fisherman. Christ appointed him as the leader of the apostles and promised to build his church upon that rock. Now, very quickly in the book of Acts, we see Peter delegating his authority to the other apostles. They become bishops, and as they spread the church throughout the cities of the ancient Roman world, they appoint overseers, bishops, to lead those cities. But Peter was the rock upon which it would all be built. And Peter went to Rome, led the church there, and died and was buried there under what is now St. Peter's Basilica. When the apostles and their generation died, some aspects of their authority passed on to the next generation in something we call apostolic succession. It's why we say we believe in one holy Catholic and apostolic church. But the point of difference between Roman Catholicism and Greek Orthodoxy, not to mention Anglicanism and some other branches of Protestantism, is that Roman Catholics hold that Peter retained his primacy, his leadership of the other bishops. And thus, the successor of Peter, the Bishop of Rome, maintained primacy over the other bishops. And therefore, in the Roman Catholic Church, the Pope, which by the way means father, as the Bishop of Rome, first among equals, appoints all of the world's bishops. And all of the world's bishops are accountable to him as their overseer in shepherding, teaching, and governing the church. There's no middle management layer. Yes, there are archbishops and cardinals, which we'll explain in a minute, but the only direct overseer for a Roman Catholic bishop is the Bishop of Rome. Fun fact number 4. Parish churches and diocesan cathedrals. The early church in the missionary era of St. Paul and the other apostles was built up through the cities of the Roman Empire. The Christians of a city would gather together for worship, prayer, and other activities with their deacons and their presbyters and their overseers. But as their numbers grew, and because some of the cities in the Roman world were very large, I mean, Rome probably had a population of 1 million residents at the time of Peter and Paul. Smaller groups would be organized in individual neighborhoods or in the suburbs or rural areas just outside the city. They would still be part of the larger Christian community or church of that city and under the umbrella leadership of the overseer or bishop of the city. These smaller groupings became parishes. And the citywide or metropolitan, as it was known in Greek and Latin, the metropolitan church became known as the diocese. Now, the etymology is interesting. Parish derives from Greek and Latin words that mean sojourning or journeying together through a strange land. So, a parish is a smaller group of Christians who journey through this life, this valley of tears together because they live nearby each other in a neighborhood or community. The word diocese comes from Latin and Greek, and it has as its roots the notion of keeping and administering a jurisdiction, or what you're in charge of. So, the little groups of sojourners living together in neighborhoods or villages surrounding a city are parishes. And the district around the city, including the countryside, is part of this administrative diocese from which a bishop shepherds and governs all of these little bands. And of course, whichever church is his seat of authority is the diocesan cathedral. Fun fact number 5: archbishops and cardinals, abbots and superiors. If you follow Catholicism, you'll see or hear about all of these other bigwigs running around, archbishops and cardinals and abbots and religious superiors. So, who are all these people and where do they fit in? Do they all have cathedrals too? Well, let's start with archbishops. Now, during Roman times, as now, some cities were bigger than others and dominated a province. So the Romans, they would consider a big city that influenced an entire province a metropolis, which in Greek literally means mother city. So it's the mother city that sort of dominates a region or province. And that concept passed over into the organization of the Roman Catholic Church. So for example, during the late Roman or medieval period, there were lots of smaller cities in central France. Each of those smaller cities had its own diocese, bishop, and cathedral, of course. But Paris was obviously the center of culture and commerce and communications and whatnot. It was the mother city, the metropolis of central France. And the Bishop of Paris became a metropolitan bishop or archbishop, and his diocese became an archdiocese. In fact, the cathedral of an archdiocese is often called a metropolitan cathedral, and the cities in its orbit become part of an episcopal province. Now, some metropolitan archdioceses are so big, think New York or Los Angeles or whatnot, and have so many parishes in the greater metro area that it's literally impossible for the archbishop himself to properly serve them. So, archdioceses sometimes have what are called auxiliary bishops. Now, these guys are real bishops, but they serve a section of the greater metro area as a sort of assistant bishop to the archbishop. So, for example, Bishop Robert Barron from Word on Fire is an auxiliary bishop to the Archbishop of Los Angeles, with responsibility for the northwest portions of the greater Los Angeles metro area. Now, an archbishop doesn't have direct authority over the bishops in his province like a regional manager. They aren't a management layer like in corporate America. The archbishop isn't the regional vice president. But they can have significant influence over the dioceses in their region, in their episcopal province. And because of their proximity to those smaller dioceses, they have an awareness of what's going on in their part of the world, and they can communicate what's going on to Rome. But each individual bishop is still accountable directly to Christ and to the Holy Father in Rome. Now, cardinals are, almost always, bishops that have been given the red hat, which means that they are members of the College of Cardinals, the body that votes for a new pope. Cardinals might be diocesan bishops or archbishops, or they might be relieved of their diocesan responsibilities and brought to Rome to help manage departments in the Vatican, reporting directly to the Pope. But what about religious orders like the Benedictines or the Dominicans or the Franciscans or the Jesuits? Where do they fit in? Well, it's not our topic here, but as it relates to bishops and cathedrals, the church has two sort of parallel organizational charts, both of them accountable up the chain of command to the Pope as the successor of Peter. Now, the first chart is what we've been describing, geographically defined parishes and dioceses and bishops and metropolitan archbishops and whatnot. But the second sort of chain of command is the religious orders. And they're given a charter, each of them, by Rome, ultimately from the Pope. But they're organized in a system of superiors, which is sort of like the monastic equivalent of bishops and archbishops, and provinces, which is sort of like the monastic equivalent of archdioceses, and communities, think monasteries, convents, abbeys, whatnot, which are the monastic equivalent sort of parishes. So, for example, the Dominican order has 3 provinces in North America, on east, middle, and west, and each of those is headed by a provincial superior that acts sort of like a bishop over the Dominican friars in his province. Do religious superiors have cathedrals with seats in them? Well, no. But some orders like the Benedictines have abbots who function something like an archbishop. And the abbeys, these sort of mother abbeys, are a little bit like metropolitan cathedrals for their province. Confused? Maybe? I hope not, because I haven't even gotten into all of the weird little exceptions to all of the above rules. See, when you have a 2,000-year-old global organization, there are bound to be all kinds of little exceptions and twists and historical precedents, but we're not going there. That's not the point of the episode. Fun fact number 6, the chancery. As we've seen, the bishop is the overseer of the diocese, responsible for the threefold office of teaching, shepherding, and governing the affairs of a city and the area around it. And that means overseeing the recruitment, assignment, and supervision of priests. It means the administration of schools and hospitals and various other ministries to the poor and whatnot. It means representing and speaking for, and in some cases defending the diocese and the Catholic Church to secular governments around them. It means overseeing the sacraments in the diocese, like confirmation that the bishop participates in personally. It means keeping the sacramental records, recording births and marriages and baptisms and deaths for all the Catholics in the diocese. It means church courts and canonical tribunals for processing things like annulments. It means the opening and closing of parishes and the construction of altars and tabernacles. And of course, raising and managing finances to make all of this happen, and much, much more. Now, I generally despise secular analogies for church offices and functions, but I'll allow it in this case. In addition to being the shepherd of souls in his diocese, the bishop is its CEO. So, how does he get all of this done? Well, he has help. Every bishop supervises a staff and departments where all of the things that we just mentioned take place. And all of those staff and departments work out of a building or a complex of buildings, almost always right next door to the bishop's cathedral. And that building is called the chancery. Now, chancery is a medieval term from a Latin word for an office where scribes and clerks work. So basically, almost every diocese has a chancery next to its cathedral, which holds the offices of the scribes and clerks and officers and department heads and et cetera, which assist the bishop in the administration of his diocese. And so cathedrals are busy places, not only for masses and various liturgies and sacraments, but because people are always coming and going to the chancery next door for 1,000 reasons. And that brings up another fun fact. Many, not all, but many cathedrals have a priest known as the rector of the cathedral. As we've seen, the bishop is a pretty busy guy, and he's not always at the cathedral. On any given day, he might be visiting his parishes or traveling to meet with other bishops or even in Rome. but the masses in the cathedral must go on every day. And so, a priest is appointed to be the rector, the priest who oversees the day-to-day masses and the regular activities within the cathedral under the supervision of the bishop himself. Number 7, statistics. Just how many dioceses and bishops are there? Well, according to the most recent statistics that I could put my hands on, which are almost 3 years old, there are approximately 5,400 Roman Catholic bishops in the world, of whom just over 3,000 are diocesan bishops. Now, the others would be bishops who have been given other responsibilities in the Vatican, for example, or in specialized ministries like military chaplaincy or whatever, or retired bishops who are no longer shepherding a diocese. In the United States, there are 441 active and retired Catholic bishops who oversee 196 dioceses and archdioceses, which means that there are 196 cathedrals in the United States. Now, the United States has 15 cardinals, 6 who lead archdioceses, 5 who are retired, and 4 who are in other positions. And more than a third, 168 of U.S. bishops are retired. The remaining 273 active ones include 6 cardinals, 29 archbishops, 162 diocesan bishops, and 76 auxiliary bishops, which we talked about earlier. Now, generally, bishops submit their retirement to the Pope at age 75. About 6 to 8 bishops retire each year and are replaced, so the total number of active bishops always remains roughly the same. And the bishops themselves make up the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and they're served by a staff of approximately 315 lay people, priests, deacons, and religious that are located at the U.S. Council Catholic Bishop headquarters in Washington, D.C. You know, looking at these numbers, a couple of things stand out. First, the Pope in Rome is responsible for appointing and supervising 5,400 bishops spread around the globe. Now, obviously he has help, hence the Vatican's own chancery offices. But when we read about management or discipline problems among bishops around the world, it's easy to see how hard it is for the Pope or even the Vatican to carefully keep tabs on an organization that's as large and complex and diverse and ancient as the Roman Catholic Church. Second, compared to governments, universities, or corporations, the church is a relatively lean management structure. I mean, for an organization of this scope, spread so widely in so many locations, the number of employees and managers is, I think, remarkably small compared to what you'd see in, say, secular global corporations. And so, when we read about management problems and stuff falling through the cracks sometimes, maybe it's not a total surprise. Fun fact 8. Basilicas and cathedrals. Many folks, I think including some or many Catholics, confuse basilicas and cathedrals, and it's easy to understand why. See, in the Roman Catholic Church, churches that are special, really special, are often designated by the Pope as a basilica. There are 2 categories, basically, major basilicas and minor basilicas. Now, there are various reasons why a church would be designated as a basilica. Some of them are of great historical significance, like some of the major basilicas in Rome. For example, this is the Basilica of St. Paul outside the walls in Rome. The apostle St. Paul is actually buried here, and that makes it obviously a very special place. Or consider the Basilica of Our Lady of the Rosary in Lourdes, France, where the Virgin Mary appeared to Saint Bernadette. Or the Basilica of Saint Therese of Lisieux that commemorates that great saint and doctor of the Church. Or the Basilica of Saint Francis of Assisi, where he's buried. Now, these are magnificent and significant church buildings. Pilgrims come from all around the world to visit them. But they aren't cathedrals because they don't contain the seat of a diocesan bishop. They are overseen by the local diocesan bishop, who might have his cathedral only a short distance, a few blocks away, but not in the basilica. Now, someone would say, well, why not make some of these great basilicas cathedral churches? Well, Think of all the things that have to happen in cathedrals and how busy they and the chancery next door to them are. And then imagine trying to do all of that with hundreds of thousands of pilgrims coming through, throughout the year. Very difficult. And there are minor basilicas, churches recognized for their special beauty or local historical significance. In our own Diocese of Grand Rapids, we have, of course, the Cathedral of St. Andrew. And just a mile or two away across the river, the Basilica of St. Adalbert, recognized for its great beauty and its significance to the Polish immigrant community that gave sacrificially to build it. And all of this leads to one of the great misunderstandings in the Catholic Church. See, St. Peter's Basilica, where Peter is buried, with the Vatican chancery buildings and museums next door, is not the Cathedral Church of Rome. So, when you visit St. Peter's and marvel at Bernini's baldacchino over the altar under Michelangelo's dome, you know what you won't see? The actual chair, the cathedra of the Bishop of Rome. Because that's a couple of miles away, across the river, in a much older building, the Basilica of St. John Lateran. See, here's the chair of the Bishop of Rome, and here are the chancery offices for the Diocese of Rome just next door. So, when the Pope is functioning as the Pope of the global Catholic Church, he does it at St. Peter's. But when he's functioning as the Bishop of the metropolitan city of Rome, he does it from the Basilica of St. John Lateran. So, if you're a member of a Catholic parish in the city of Rome, you're confirmed by your bishop, the Pope, here at St. John Lateran. Number 9. In Italy, it's not called a cathedral. Crazy idea here, but in Italy, they speak Italian. They have a different word for virtually everything. And by ancient custom, because if you have a culture as old as Italy's, believe me, you have a lot of ancient cultural customs. You don't call your city's cathedral a cathedral. You call it a duomo. That's from the Latin word for house, domus. Basically, at some point in the distant Italian past, probably 1500 years ago, with the cathedral being the big church in the middle of the city where everything important happens and from which everything is administered, the people of the city and the surrounding regions started calling it, the house, as in the big house, the Duomo. So, when pilgrims or tourists travel around Italy, they can sometimes get confused. For example, one of the most iconic church buildings in Italy, arguably in all of the world, is in the center of the city of Florence. And when tourists visit Florence, they buy a ticket to climb to the top of the dome of the Duomo of Florence. I've had people ask me why it's called the Duomo. Well, because that's what Italians call their cathedrals. This was and is the cathedral church of the metropolitan city of Florence. This is the Duomo of nearby Siena in Tuscany. And this is the Duomo of Orvieto. And this is the Duomo of Milan. Now, some of you clever ones might be asking, then why isn't the Basilica of St. John Lateran called the Duomo of Rome? Good question. But the answer would take so long to explain that I'm just going to say, because it isn't. Number 10, in the shape of a cross. Not always and everywhere, but traditionally, Roman Catholic cathedrals have a cruciform floor plan, which is a fancy way of saying that from above, they're shaped like a cross. The long part here is called the nave. And if that sounds like the word navel, it's not a coincidence. It's from the same root meaning ship. Because this is the part where the people of God sit or stand for Mass. Because we are in a ship, the ship of St. Peter, sailing through this troubled world of sin on our way to salvation and everlasting life. The two horizontal arms of the cross are called the transepts. Traditionally, very large cathedrals have side chapels or tabernacles in the transepts. The vertical part above the center of the cross is called the apse. Now, traditionally, the bishop's seat would be located here as it is in the Basilica of St. John Lateran. And in the center, the intersection of the cross is usually where the altar is located. It's all centered on the sacrifice of Christ and the Eucharist. You know, once you begin to visit these magnificent cathedrals from our Catholic heritage, I think you become comforted when you enter another one. There's a sort of familiarity with the layout and the design. And then you marvel at the unique characteristics and variations within any particular cathedral that give it its own unique sort of local identity. Catholicism's DNA is coded with a commitment to what is true and what is good and, well, what is beautiful. And so our spiritual identity gave birth to an architectural tradition that strove to incarnate, to embody, to give physical form to truth, goodness, and beauty. And as a result, the Roman Catholic Church has an architectural heritage with an impressive portfolio of beautiful buildings, basilicas and cathedrals, abbeys and shrines all over the world. But when we look at places in the world where Catholicism or Christianity itself has atrophied or evaporated or been even forcibly removed, we're left with nothing but empty museums full of old art with tourists walking around through them, holding up smartphones for selfies without any real comprehension of what they're looking at, why it was built, why so many generations gave so much to create these incredible spaces. So many people today don't grasp that to be Catholic is to live under the spiritual authority of a bishop, and that cathedrals are the seats of our bishops. And therefore, whenever our bishops are strong and godly leaders who build truly Catholic communities with a vibrant diocesan life, the cathedral will and should be full of life and energy, and sometimes hustle and bustle, and sometimes even turmoil and controversy, because they're the centers around which our life as a Catholic community ought to orbit. So let us pray for our bishops and assist them in building those kinds of communities. And perhaps our diocesan cathedrals will once again become places that future generations will marvel at. Thank you for your time, and God bless. At the beginning of this episode, we visited St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, Scotland, and the Crystal Cathedral in Orange County, California. And even though those places seem to have absolutely nothing in common other than they both have the word cathedral in their name, I teased you with this ironic riddle. One of them used to actually be a cathedral, but isn't anymore. And the other never was a cathedral, but recently became one. And now, the rest of that story. At one time, St. Giles was a cathedral church, the seat of the Roman Catholic Bishop of Edinburgh under the Archdiocese of St. Andrews. But in 1559, during the Protestant Reformation, it was taken over by Scottish Protestants under the leadership of the Calvinist John Knox and became part of the Protestant Church of Scotland. It was deconsecrated as a Roman Catholic church because the Church of Scotland is Presbyterian in its governance, which means that it doesn't have bishops. And so it can't be the seat of any bishop, much less a Roman Catholic one. It only keeps the name cathedral because of the historical associations, and it sounds cool to tourists. On the other hand, the Crystal Cathedral was founded as a congregation in the Protestant Reformed Church in America, based right here like Lane in Holland, Michigan, by the Reverend Robert Schuller. He was a television megachurch celebrity pastor, and while he was rich and influential, he was never a bishop, much less a Roman Catholic bishop. Now, Schuller called it the Crystal Cathedral because, well, he kind of liked the name. He thought it sounded impressive. However, in one of God's great historical ironies, the Crystal Cathedral went, well, bankrupt in 2010. Long story, I could tell you all about it sometime, but suffice it to say that they went kaput and they couldn't maintain the place. So, the Roman Catholic Diocese of Orange County, seeing an opportunity, bought the building in 2012 and renamed it Christ Cathedral. It has been renovated and consecrated to become a proper space for Catholic sacraments. See the altar with a reliquary and icons? Christ Cathedral is now the seat of the Bishop of Orange County, and the campus around it has become the Diocesan Chancery. So, there you go. A cathedral that was and isn't anymore, and a fake cathedral that became the real thing to the glory of God. See, I keep telling you, the Catholic story really is one whirling adventure.